I was reflecting on the way here. There's a strange thing, isn't there, about introductions? I don't know if probably Martin, at least he does know me from other occasions, so he's got a modest amount of trust in me, I suppose. But I always also feel that the person who's being introduced always sits there thinking, "Oh God, they're going to get something wrong," and so on. I mean, I know in my history, I've been introduced as once at IBM, at an IBM conference, as lorry trailer. And then once, on a memorable occasion, I was introduced as the well-known Scientologist. So I thought, God Almighty! And I speculated a little bit. I was just coming here tonight about sort of people who are good at intros, and it came back to me, and I remembered. I remember going to it was a great big evening run by, I think, the Times Higher Educational Supplement. They were giving awards to universities, and saying how wonderful universities were. And for some reason or other, don't quite know why, they'd hired Bob Monkhouse to do it. Now, I mean, I'd seen Bob Monkhouse on the television, and always I sort of quite liked Bob Monkhouse in a way. There was something old-fashioned and wonderful about the way he kept going. And on this evening, I remember that he started off, and I thought, how is he going to talk to this audience? It's an academic audience. It's got vice chancellors, and I remember he started up and he said, lords and ladies, he said, principals and presidents, chancellors and vice chancellors, distinguished guests, members and associates, he said, readers and senior lecturers, chefs and waiters, he said, doorkeepers and barmen, lavatory attendants, ladies and gentlemen of the press. And I thought, what a lovely start, because everybody was immediately on his side. And I suppose the other thing was that I used to belong to a working men's club in York when I used to sort of teach up at York University, and I can remember a man there who used to come on. He was the club secretary, and since we had the wheel tappers and shunters disappeared from the television, I remember him coming on and saying, right, he said, the next act we're going to have, he said, it's a group of coloured chaps. He said, I saw them earlier on, don't think much of them, see what you make of them. And I thought, that has got to be the end introduction. That's the worst introduction. So I'll try and do a little better than at least the wheel tappers and shunters man. I should say that actually it was always a danger of little statements, because I do this radio programme which was kindly mentioned by Flora in the introduction, called Thinking Aloud, which isn't going terribly well at the moment, because I got called in recently by the new head of Radio 4, and she said there was something missing from the programme, and it's a social science programme. So I said, well, we're not doing enough on social mobility. She said, no, it's not that. I said, well, what, ethnic relations? She said, no, not that. I said, well, globalisation? She said, no, it's not that. So I said, what exactly is missing? And she said, it's listeners. She said, you're a bit short of listeners. And this is how I discovered, because I went along to the audience research department and said, could you just tell me the figures for the listenership? And they've got huge surveys there, and they eventually pointed to the screen, and on the screen it said -2, and I said to the man who was in charge, well, -2? He said, well, that means to say that not only is nobody listening to your programme, but 2 people who haven't heard it are going around criticising it. So that was the sort of concern. But I had this. I'll get into Martin in a second. But because I got this email. I'm just warning about the problems of starting in a wrong way, because I got this email not long ago from someone who said, I was a student of yours at York University in the late 60s, he said, and I heard you introduce your programme the other day by saying, I'm glad to be here. He said, I should think at your age you must be glad to be anywhere. So that was the start of that. So let me turn now to Martin, because in a way I've introduced Martin, I think, on a couple of occasions before. So I'll dispense first of all with the usual stuff that one says about Martin. I'll remind you that he's chairman of the Cartoonist Association, that he's the 2010 Cartoonist of the Year, an award which is actually presented to him here in the Frontline Club. Cartoonists on The Guardian, Mirror, on Tribune, Morning Star, New Statesman, Observer, Time Out, you name it, almost everywhere. A constant and wonderful outpouring of cartoons. The slightly less usual business, perhaps I should mention that I also think would, if you don't know him, also apart from a fine artist, fine cartoonist, also a fine writer, and his book, Stuff, is a totally original, I think we describe it as a sort of biography, enchanting, gripping, subtle, and wonderfully sophisticated meander through his early life. But apart from that, I mean, in a way, one of my favourites is a book which in a way was a response to Richard Dawkins's certainty about the way in which religion was doomed and science was going to triumph. And Martin wrote a lovely book called The Dog Illusion, which, as it were, puts together and suggests that there is some sort of complementarity between our appreciation of pets and our invention of gods. I should also mention that the thing I've enjoyed most recently from Martin was a wonderful, we call them graphic novels, but a wonderful Tristram Shandy, which is one of my all-time favourite books, and Martin has done an absolutely beautiful illustrated account storyline. So if you've ever read Tristram Shandy, it's wonderful to go to this and look at the illustrations which accompany this masterpiece of English literature. And also, just to add in, while I'm mentioning Uncle Toby, who's the hero of Tristram Shandy, the most wonderful storyteller, that Martin is also a great storyteller, a wonderful storyteller, and I've sat almost at his feet sometimes because I consume too much drink, but otherwise in adoration, as he told wonderful stories about some of the meetings with people like Alistair Campbell and Gordon Brown, the subjects of his coruscating cartoons. And I'd probably end up by saying also that he's a humanist. Not only does he work and do wonderful material for the New Humanist, of which I'm one of the associate editors, that he's also, in the true meaning of humanist, he's life-affirming, he's on the side of the underdog, consistently on the side of the underdog, intolerant of piety and scourge of hypocrisy. He's going to talk to us tonight about his art and his craft. Martin Rowson.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and thank you all for coming on a wet, cold, miserable Tuesday evening at the beginning of February. And I hope you've been put at your ease when you came in here by having not one but two Alistair Campbells glowering down at you, keeping you in your place, as he kept so many of us in our places when he was the second most powerful man in the country. As Blair's Director of Communications, the second most powerful man in the country after, of course, Rupert Murdoch. And I've got him up here because one thing that Laurie didn't mention, another feather in my hat, or was it a feather in your bow, I can never remember, was a gig I had in the Gay Hussar restaurant from 1999 to 2005. Now, probably many of you know about the Gay Hussar. It's this Hungarian restaurant in Greek Street, which for the last 50 years or so has been the watering place or watering hole of choice for both the political and the journalistic elite. Not only did Harold Wilson's entire cabinet go there for lunch, and the then manager Victor Sassy would have terrible problems about where to seat them, so they couldn't hear each other conspiring against each other. But Tom Dryburgh, the serial fallationist left-wing MP, tried to persuade Mick Jagger to stand as a Labour MP up in the private dining room on the third floor, which is now known as the Tom Dryburgh Memorial Suite, and rather blew it when he started fondling Mick's knee. And at the same time, Mick had brought Marianne Faithfull along, and Dryburgh had brought W.H. Auden, and they were sort of sitting there not speaking to each other, as you'd expect. And Auden, finally, through a wreath of smoke, turned to Marianne Faithfull and said, "Tell me, do you ever smuggle drugs into the country?" And she said, "I've done." I said, "Ever take them up the arse?" And the evening broke up in confusion, as many evenings do at the Gay Hussar, including on one occasion George Brown being thrown out of the restaurant because he was feeling up the woman sitting next to him on the banquette. And one night I was leaving the place at about midnight, and I thought, you know, this needs something more than the photographs of superannuated politicians and Hungarian peasants which adorn the walls. And I offered he still is the manager, John Robel, that I would come in and draw his celebrity patrons in exchange for one free meal a pop. And I would draw them from the life during the course of their lunch times, and it would be a kind of Cartier-Bresson cartoon. I wouldn't do any preparatory sketches. I'd just sit there in a corner, wheezing consumptively, sipping at absinthe in a nice bohemian way, and I would capture these people these people who had helped to a large extent create the second half of the 20th century. And he said, great, and all I got was a free meal, didn't get any other money, and I liked getting out into the field and drawing from life, and so it happened. And if you go to the Gay Who's Are now, you will find 60 of these images up on the wall. And we had all sorts in there. We had David Blunkett. I missed a major scoop because I didn't know who the heavily pregnant, dark-haired American woman with him was. I had Michael Foote, I had Will Self, I had Glenda Jackson. I had several occasions when I'm amazed when I was drawing Michael Howard and Michael Heseltine and Michael Portello that the pen didn't leap out of my hand and drive itself through my eyeballs. And we finally got Alistair Campbell on my daughter's birthday, on the 21st of May 2002. And I'm showing you this picture of Campbell because it was the first time I realised something about my profession, which actually put it in a far greater perspective than I'd put it in previously. Because all my previous subjects or victims had sort of sat there and got on with their meal and chatted away, and I'd drawn them, you know, very much as a kind of fly on the wall, or if you prefer, fly on your soup, kind of documentarian. The day I drew Campbell, the restaurant which was about half the size of this room, was packed solid. It was very, very full. But the atmosphere in there was so chilly you could have kept a side of beef in there for about a month. Because Campbell hated what I was doing to him. He absolutely hated it. Because he is, by definition, a control freak. And he hated it so much, at one point, he shouted across the restaurant, in front of all these members of the public, "You just won't be able to stop yourself from making me look like a really bad human being." To which I replied, "Alistair, I draw what I see." And at that moment, I realised something about him. That not only was he a total control freak, he was like a very sort of primitive member of a South Sea Island tribe who, encountering a photographer for the first time, was convinced I was stealing his soul. And to a large extent I was. What I was engaged in was sympathetic magic. It was voodoo, certainly, doing damage to somebody at a distance with a sharp object, in this case a pen. But also it was shamanistic, it was shape-shifting, it was taking the way he presents himself to the world and passing it through my own consciousness and recreating him on a piece of paper. And although I'm sure everybody here would doubt that Alistair Campbell has a soul, his soul had duly been stolen because I had recreated him in a shamanistic way, in a shape-shifting way. And he proved that he thought his soul had been stolen by, when I took it to him for him to record, him to sign as a true record of himself during the course of his lunchtime, he dissed me. He diffused the bad magic I'd woven round him by saying, "This is a good picture of Paxman, where the fuck is the one of me?" And so I suddenly, my God, I'm doing something really, really primitive and primal. That this is, in fact, the whole nature of art. Art is about recreating the observable reality around us and sort of echolocating off it so we can take control of it and help make sense of our lives. And in political cartoons, this is even more valid than it is in any other area of art. So, anyway, having taken that original leap into recreating somebody through caricature, exaggerating their features, shifting their shape, you can do all sorts of exciting things. So, here is Campbell spinning a Tony Blair plate on the end of a pole, with Murdoch down there applauding. Here he is at the time of the Sexed Up's dossier. "Hey baby, if I sex you up, will you come in 45 minutes? And you don't just have to sort of change them slightly to turn them into marionettes to move them around in a narrative of the cartoonist's own devising. You can change them into anything you want. And this was a cartoon described on the Today programme on Radio 4 as sulphurous, that came out in 2002 at the time of a story most people have now forgotten, which was a very nice little story, which was about how Blair was allegedly using Campbell to put pressure on Black Rod to give Blair a bigger role in the Queen Mother's funeral. Now, we don't know whether Blair wanted to actually lie inside the coffin with her or merely carry the spare wheel of the gun carriage. We don't know what he was actually intending to do. But it was a great story, and I suddenly remember, and in this occasion, actually, the shit did hit the fan because the story was broken by Peter Oborne in The Spectator. And there was a huge row about it. And I suddenly remember that wonderful description by John Biffin of Thatcher's press secretary, Bernard Ingham. He was the sewer, not the sewage. And so here, what we have is we have Campbell as this toilet. So he's transformed through the magic of caricature into a toilet, blocked up, there's black rod sticking out of it. But it goes further than that. It goes a lot further, because we've got Blair up there, obviously. But down here, as a turd, we have Peter Oborne, who broke the story. And here we have the then chairman of the Labour Party, old fatty big ears himself, Charles Clarke, as a tampon. Now, this is utterly disgraceful material. That this should appear in a family newspaper is beyond belief. I showed this, I've just been to a conference in Berlin. I showed this cartoon there, and they sort of a slight nervous intake of breath. I went on a nice British Council League to India last year, and I'd show it to people in India, and they would have a much louder intake of breath. How on earth can we get away with this kind of thing? Well, we've been getting away with it for over 300 years. And I'm in a very, very long tradition. We've had satirical images probably since the first hominid picked up a bit of burnt stick, drew one of his fellow hominids on a cave wall and said, "God, your bum's big, isn't it? Your spear's missed that woolly rhino." Gothic cathedrals are embellished with gargoyles, which are caricatures of the chapter and dean. The stonemasons are evening up the balance between themselves and the elite and the power by sort of taking the piss out of them. Ever since printing, there's been the dissemination of satirical material. However, in the end of the 17th century, there was a paradigm shift, which was a pure accident, one of the most beautiful moments in the history of these islands. Whereas these satirical prints had been produced to support the parties of various rich and powerful men who could offer patronage and protection to the poor bloody engravers who made them. In 1695, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, they forgot to renew the censorship laws. Somebody forgot to timetable into the parliamentary schedule. And by the time they realised the mistake they'd made, it was too late. That everything had actually erupted out of Pandora's box. And there started to emerge not just partisan visual attacks and written attacks, but satire in all its glory, where they attacked everything, where they attacked the elites irrespective of party. And so from that moment on, the 18th century, which is one of my favourite centuries as long as you don't have to live there, because it was pretty unpleasant, you have the Enlightenment, but running through the middle of it, you have this open sewer of satire. You have Pope, you have Swift, you have Hogarth, you have Gilray towards the end of the century. And here we have this fantastic image by Hogarth, which I'm showing you not only because it sums up how we think we probably understand the 18th century, as this sort of earthy, rumbustious, really rather jovial kind of horrific place, but also because it says something about what my craft is really about, and it's why I'm speaking to you here in this venue this evening, because it's journalism. This was produced, it's called Gin Lane, as I'm sure you know, in response to a news story Hogarth heard about a French woman who had murdered her infant child, her infant daughter, in order to sell the girl's clothes in order to buy gin. And gin was this scourge of the urban poor, because we're talking about the largest city the world had ever seen, and which had no flush toilets. And in fact, every morning the night soil men would go around gathering the bodily refuse of the night before and then dump it in places like Islington. No change there. And he produced this. This is a comment on the evils of gin. It is also a comment on urbanism, but it's a comment in a particular way. It's a polemical image produced very much in the same way as a tabloid headline is about an old woman who's murdered for a pension and also hoodies can buy crack. But it's done in a particular way because it starts off, the central image of it is a pastiche. It is a pastiche of the Madonna and child, but in this case a pissed up Madonna whose child is falling down this stairwell to his certain death, and Hogarth actually burnished out the original where the floor went there, so he's clearly going to die. But behind him you see dogs and drunks fighting over bones. You see a carpenter pawning the tools of his trade in order to buy gin. You see gin being forced down the throats of infants and cripples. You see bodies being disinterred. You see people hanging themselves in crumbling tenements. It is sledgehammer humour, but it is humour. The point of it is to make a joke, but make a joke in a polemical way, but also in a journalistic way, because the original of this does not exist and hasn't done for 250 years. It exists solely as a journalistic image to be reproduced over and over again and to be hung up on the walls of the basements and tenements where the urban poor lived. And it had a companion piece which was called Beer Street, which was meant to say, well, you can go and get drunk, but get drunk in a nice way, drink nice British beer. And Hogarth is a great inspiration to me, because he was the first truly superstar cartoonist, although they wouldn't have used the term cartoonist at the time. And he was succeeded some way a generation later by the other great 18th century cartoonist, who was James Gilray, described by David Lowe as the father of the political cartoon, where he's described Hogarth as the grandfather of the political cartoon. And those ingredients I was describing earlier on, taking people, shifting them through the magic of caricature into something new, into a caricatured new paradigm and a new creation of the caricaturist, and then set up in a narrative like marionettes, is here set in concrete. And this is the plum pudding in danger. Actually, the greatest statement ever made about geopolitics, and it's an eternal statement. You could replace Pitt and Bonaparte with anybody you care to think of, Hitler and Stalin, Bush and Osama bin Laden. No, they are carving up the world between them. And this image has been pastiched over and over and over again by Gilray's successors. And of course he was mainlining what satire is about. Satire is, in the most pompous phrase in the language, about puncturing pomposity. It's also about ripping aside the raiments of the rich and the powerful and showing that they're the same pissing, shitting, stinking, bleeding bastards as the rest of us. And here we have this wonderful image of Pitt the Younger in order to fund the Napoleonic Wars. He brought in paper money for the first time, and here he is vomiting all this paper money and shitting into the Bank of England, shitting money into the Bank of England. And I pastiche this in 1998 of Gordon Brown failing to shit money into the public sector. And here we have Gordon Brown and, what's his name? Howard, that's right, Michael Howard, fighting over the remnants of the British car industry. And this is a pastiche of this fantastic image, which appears at first sight to be a jingoistic, straightforward piece of jingoism of Jack Tar, who is the naval avatar of John Bull, biffing Bonaparte on the nose after the Battle of Copenhagen. And so far, so good. But as I've been trying to explain to every editor I've ever worked for, cartoons are not illustrations. They are not illustrations of the editorial. They are something else. They're a chimera. They're a mutant. And they're a mutant because they, even if they have no words, they always have the implication of words. And what Gilray beautifully did here, he had this nice jingoistic image, completely subverting it with his caption, "Fighting for the dunghill." It's all just a load of shit. Which brings us galloping through the centuries up to my last great inspiration, who was David Lowe, who was responsible in a way for our victory in the Second World War, because he had been taking the piss out of the Nazis since 1933. This image appeared about 6 months after the Nazis came to power, and it's the Western foreign ministers meeting the Nazis, the difficulty of shaking hands with gods. And his attitude to the Nazis led to terrible diplomatic repercussions. In 1935, Lord Halifax, then the Foreign Secretary, went for a hunting weekend with Goering. Don't you just love these Tories? And Goering spent the entire weekend complaining about David Lowe's images. These cartoons were seriously jeopardising good Anglo-German relations. So Halifax told Beaverbrook, Beaverbrook told Lowe's editor on the Evening Standard, and so Lowe, as a consequence, stopped drawing Hitler and Mussolini and created a composite cartoon character called Muzzler, who was a composite dictator. But in 1943, there was a debate in the House of Commons about official propaganda, and a Tory MP stood up and said, David Lowe's work is worth all the official propaganda put together, because he makes them look like bloody fools. And people who organise torchlit parades and book burning and wear stupid uniforms and have stupid moustaches, the last thing they can, or the first thing they will fail to tolerate, the last thing they can stand is people laughing. And as a consequence, Lowe was on the Gestapo death list along with Vicky and other cartoonists, and Illingworth, strangely enough. And it was that laughter at the Nazis which was one of the things which actually helped us as a nation, along with having an alcoholic as Prime Minister, the kind of person who reels out of the pub drunkenly at closing time, says, "I'll take you all on," that helped us stand against them. And in Denmark, they had a history of cartoonists portraying the Nazis as terrible monsters, which of course they were. But the most successful propaganda film of the Second World War was some footage of a Nuremberg rally, which a couple of film editors had cut to the sound of the Lambeth Walk. So you just see all these Nazis goose-stepping to the sound of the Lambeth Walk, and we were laughing ourselves stupid at them. They were monsters, but they were laughable monsters. On a more sombre tone, this is possibly just as The Plum Pudding in Danger is one of the most famous cartoons ever. This is another of the most famous cartoons ever. This was at the outbreak of the Second World War, when Hitler and Stalin greet each other over the slain corpse of Poland. And Lowe described this as the most bitter cartoon of his career. The scum of the earth, I believe, the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. And it's one of those cartoons that actually entered the sort of collective consciousness in a way, which is why it is possible to pastiche it over and over again. I'm just going to give you one example. This was after Blair invited Thatcher to Number 10 as the first politician he invited there, that died in the wool. Socialist archipizza of Brussels, I believe. A callous record of the social fabric, I presume. Would you care for some brioche? And there you can just sort of make out the rotting form of John Major underneath the welcome mat. And so we get on to Blair. Here he is at the 2001 Labour Party conference. You can just spot down here, that's my friend and colleague Steve Bell. That's me drawing him. This was when he was delivering that speech after 9/11, which has been described by the right-wing historian Andrew Roberts as one of the greatest pieces of oratory of the modern age, where he said, with the eyes of a 4-year-old child about to burst into tears, we must take our values to the refugee camps of the Gaza Strip and the hills of Afghanistan. These poor people haven't got enough problems without wonks handing out position papers on PFI hospitals. But there he is. And that's how I drew him. This is Andrew Marr, the evangelist, with the Prime Minister on the Mount of Olives, BBC News. And now we're just going to we're going to run through Tony in a bit. Here he is. This is my favourite drawing of Blair. This is at the time of the 97 election when they'd issued their manifesto. So the Andrex puppy, soft, strong, and surprisingly long. But again, this is the magic. This is the transformative magic. It's almost like lycanthropy, what you can do to these people. Here he is. This is Master's voice. Here he is as a poodle trying to get rid of Saddam Hussein and ripping his own guts out. Here he is as a poodle catching a George Galloway bone. Here he is as a poodle bringing peace to the Middle East. You'll notice all that peace in the Middle East. He's tripping over the stuff in the streets. There's so much peace. And here he is as a sunset behind Gordon with one of those terrible smiles you must never allow within 500 yards of a child. And this was just before Gordon became Prime Minister. I just want to run quickly through how one deals with new characters on the block. Because, like many of my colleagues, I had a terrible problem this last election. First of all, I had the problem that I thought the whole thing was utterly disgusting and boring and vile. Hence this image of a Godzilla-type election creature. Wake up and run for your lives, it's general election, and its even more evil sidekick media obsession, which is a tapeworm coming out of its arse. But it's got the head of Cameron and the head of Gordon and the head of Clegg with a sort of hung Parliament forked tongue coming out. Now, my problem was I couldn't draw Nick Clegg. I couldn't draw Nick Clegg for the simple reason I didn't think it was worth bothering learning how to do it. And neither did any of my colleagues. And, you know, we were also suffering from the problem which Rory Bremner is still suffering from. When he was asked if he can do Nick Clegg, he replies, well, Nick Clegg can't do Nick Clegg yet. And I really was doing him very badly. This was just before the first TV debate, when they brought out their manifestos, and that is, frankly, a terrible drawing of Nick Clegg. I mean, it just doesn't look anything like him. But that was the best I could do. And it was just going completely wrong. And then there was the TV debate, and for the first time I saw Clegg moving. And it was a revelation. It was almost a sort of Damascene moment of revelation, because I realised he looked like a weird combination of Private Pike from Dad's Army and Pinnochio. So the next day I did this cartoon, which was just a sort of pretty straight caricature of him, with Cameron covered in the ash from the volcano in Iceland. And if you remember Cameron's wonderful expression during that TV debate, the expression of a French aristocrat in a tumbril going towards the guillotine, sort of not understanding what was going wrong, because this was meant to be a coronation. They got Murdoch on side, they had the most unpopular Labour leader ever, a worn-out and exhausted Labour government. Cameron should have walked in with a 100-seat majority, and suddenly it was all going horribly wrong. Anyway, I did him straight, and then I thought, actually, let's have a go at the Pinnochio thing. Let's see if it works, because after all, this is a little wooden boy who wants to be a real politician. And it might just work, you know, if the punters get it. So the following Monday I produced this image. There's old Vince saying the Teddy Fairy's promise has come true, you have turned into a real politician, and there's Clegg Pinnochio sort of rattling away. And the punters got it straight away. Not only did they get it, they liked it. They knew where I was going. And this meant I suddenly had a wonderful realm of opportunity opened up to me. So here we are, Monday before the election, you know, when it looks like the bond markets might pull the rug underneath us, and we'll have a sort of Greek type scenario. So there's Dave skipping along in his little Lord Fauntleroy, which is how I've always drawn him, because he is little Lord Fauntleroy, with his fat cat under his arm. Clegg Pinnochio behind him with, to my despair, a copy of The Guardian in his hand. Christ almighty, how did that happen? And there's a dead Gordon. And by the end of the week, we have Britain just got brokener. So you have Gordon with the maggots coming out of him, and there is the broken puppet who's actually now going to give out power. Gordon's trying to stick the wires onto his hand. It's not working, the strings, and, you know, here we are. We're going to have a coalition. And aren't they adorable? Aren't they just heavenly? I mean, I want to merchandise goods of these two. They're just so cuddly. I love them to death. But of course, because he's a little wooden boy, you can do all sorts of things with him. So this is new ministerial transport, so he's turning into the spokes of the wheel with Vince and, oh God, what was his name? That bloke who went... Laws, thank you, David Laws. David Laws. It's a terrible shame David Laws went, because he had that kind of desiccated, Jesuitical face you need if you're going to have an austerity government, because he's the kind of person who could explain to the victims of an atrocity why it was for their own good. But unfortunately, he found it necessary to basically steal £180,000 worth of public money. But there you go. So there he is, and here we are, the state opening of Parliament. There he is, little Clegg Pinnochio running away, and there's Cameron. He's so pleased he's Prime Minister. He's so exciting! Oh, hooray, hooray! And up the top we have George Osborne with his fat cats, who I've now started dressing as a kind of Flashman-esque fifth form bully. The original of this is hanging up in the wardroom of the Yeoman of the Guard in St James's Palace, because they liked it so much, and they actually knew what kind of chainsaw I'd drawn, although I just got it off the internet. So. And anyway, we then go on, and by the summer, you know, it's a pretty shitty government. We know that. They're going to have this pretty shitty expenditure review. They have lots of cuts. They're actually rather hopeless and awful. There's Gove in the back, you know, who's proving to be a Copros touch of a minister who's clearly alienated all his civil servants. There's Danny Alexander, who I've now started drawing as a Beaker from the Muppet Show. So we have a government of schoolboys and puppets, and poor old Vince has been buried up to his neck while Cameron's dancing off into the sea, and here is poor old Cleggy, who's been dismantled to make into the deck chair. And on it goes, and there we have the nice story about Cameron moving in to stop them banning school milk, with Thatcher in the background, and her rocking chair is made out of bits of Clegg. That's actually an Andy Coulson troll down there, by the way. And here we have that wonderful story about Lola the cat. There's the growth cat being dropped into this bin. And up there, Cameron has just had his baby, and that's pushchairs made out of bits of Clegg. Incidentally, I said, you know, say what you like about Gordon Brown, and I said most of it. We knew nothing of what his children looked like until he ceased to be Prime Minister, whereas Cameron whored his infant daughter to the world's press within 48 hours of it being born. Just reflecting, you know. And here we come to the spending review, and there is this kind of difference engine of the public and private sector, and here we finally have Osborne being handed by Danny Alexander a baseball bat, which has been carved out of the limbs of Clegg Pinnochio. And then we have the students. He's been reduced to the sort of staves which they carry their placards on. While Cameron Osborne starts booting things in. And then we have this wonderful moment when the Duchess of Cornwall was poked with a stick, and there's Vince as a nodding dog, while Osborne and Cameron are sort of driving off into this mad Thatcherite dystopia of their fantasies, and there's bits of Clegg being thrown by the children who are not actually, probably not by the children he lied to. Clegg, I think it's very interesting that Clegg lied to children. And then to cover his shame, he had school children subjected to cavalry charges outside the Houses of Parliament. This is not clever politics, because these children are upper middle class children. These are the people who will be the lawyers and politicians of tomorrow, and he's completely alienated them by having them charged by cavalry. It's like Dr. Zhivago. Weird. Anyway, enough of that. Here we get back to Tony's teeth. Tony's teeth during the first inquiry into the Iraq War. You'll notice there's some fecal Alistair Campbell toothpaste there. Here's Tony's ear when 1.5 million people marched through the streets of London on my 44th birthday, the 15th of February 2003, saying no. So he's saying that's yes then, and we have some transformative earwax in the form of George Bush up there. And here we have Tony's backbone. Gee, what a swell present, Tommy. And here we have his backbone again, replaced by a Union Jack. Sorry, not a Union Jack, an American flag. And here we have him as Nebuchadnezzar, the famous king of Mesopotamia who went mad and went and ate grass in the fields. And this is, of course, based on a famous image by William Blake, because that's what we do. We steal things to short-circuit into people's minds. And that also inspired this image after the Alderman Saddleworth election of Cameron, taking the broken-up bits of poor old Pinnochio. And also, amongst the cast of characters, Pinnochio has got back his conscience in the form of Simon Hughes, who's Jiminy Cricket up there. And also, you'll see they're dancing around the fat cat, who's their favourite creature, and that's actually a pastiche, for no particularly good reason except to keep myself quiet, of the cover of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And this is a mucky postcard by the great Donald McGill, and this is the collapse of Northern Rock, and this is Botticelli's Venus, and this isn't. And I'm showing this image of Anne Widdecombe because part of this 300-year-long history of which I'm a part is the relationship between cartoonists and politicians. And for almost all of that 300 years, it's been a very strange, sort of abusive symbiosis. Gilray was petitioned for months, if not years, by the agents and friends of George Canning, who subsequently became Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary and then Prime Minister, to put him in one of Gilray's satirical prints, because he wouldn't have arrived, he wouldn't be considered to be sufficiently serious and important unless he'd been in one of Gilray's prints. And he ended up by putting him in the back of this wonderful scene of sort of a Jacobin London, where they're defenestrating people from the clubs of Pall Mall, and Charles James Fox is flogging Pitt the Younger at the sort of whipping post, and there's Canning right in the background hanging from a lamppost in a very sort of kind of fuck off kind of way put there by Gilray. And it's been said that the one thing worse for a politician than appearing in a political cartoon is not appearing in a political cartoon, because they're insufficiently interesting or well known or recognisable to be put in one. I mean, I got around it with Clegg, but there are certain members of this government I have no idea what they look like. Haven't a clue. What John Hutton, who I think was in every government since 1997. I don't know what he looks like now. John Hutton? You could walk in here now. He probably is in here, for all I know. I don't know what he looks like. My readers don't know what he looks like. He doesn't know what he looks like. So, you know, he can't do anything about him. But Anne Widdecombe, we all know what Anne Widdecombe looks like. And I interviewed her for The Spectator a couple of years ago, because I wanted to see what it was like to be a victim of satire. And she said that it was all just jolly good fun. She thought it was all just jolly good fun. I said, no, Anne, it's not. It is assassination without the blood. This is genuine primitive voodoo. We are trying to destroy you and destroy your career. And of course, she had to maintain the fiction that it was all completely fine, because that's what politicians and democracies do. Because the one thing they cannot admit to is not having a sense of humour. And they have various responses. Some of them, like John Major, get it completely wrong. When he was asked what he thought of Steve Bell portraying him in his underpants on the outside, said, I pay no attention to it whatsoever. It is merely an attempt to destabilise my government. And others of them ignore it, like Blair and Thatcher, and a lot of them buy the original and hang it in their toilets. And you don't have to be a Freudian to work out what's going on there. They're sort of purging the rest of the shit. Anyway, there she is again in Strictly Come Dancing. And this is Tony's tongue after Saddam Hussein, Tony's tongue by inference when they renamed French fries, Liberty fries in Congress. And here is Tony's tongue licking Bush's arse. And this is when I filed this, the commentator of The Guardian said he made him feel physically sick. So I said, well, don't worry, I can deal with that. I'll just shorten it. We should have some animation now. It works. Yeah, there we go. Hardly Mickey Mouse, but you get the point. And here we have Blair before Chilcot going up a Blair way to heaven. Sort of, congratulations, you are now leaving reality. And here we have the cartoon that won the 2002 Political Cartoon of the Year, which was objected to by the editor of The Guardian for portraying the presidential bottom. Apparently people find that kind of thing upsetting, and they find all sorts of things upsetting. I'm just going to quickly whiz, because I know I'm sort of running a bit short of time, quickly whiz through some cartoons which have led to people being incredibly angry. Because this stuff now appears on the internet, so it has a global audience of people who are looking out to be insulted and offended, because being offended is actually a political weapon. It's a very clever political weapon, because you don't say, I disagree with you, you say, you've offended me, which means you must now shut up, and I've won the argument. And this one, I got about 6,000 emails saying, fuck off, you cunt. Forgive me the language, I'm just quoting what they said. And I got a lot of that under Bush. When Bush went, I thought I'd see the end of that. Here he is, Bush being hosed off the flag. You'll just see that Tony Blair skid mark in the middle. And while I was delighted that Obama was elected, it's not my job to be a cheerleader for any politician. So here he is winning the Nobel Peace Prize. You'll notice his feet are embedded in sort of clay or concrete, the concrete of Afghanistan, which is going to be kept up by hope and rhetoric. And a year after he was elected, sort of Christmas Eve 2009, I did this cartoon which I don't get fuck off you cunt emails anymore. I get moderated comments on the Guardian website. And many people were utterly outraged by this. They thought it was racist. But they were Democrats who were actually taking the fact that I had portrayed him in an unflattering way, strange to a whole lot more people this time last year. It's called Messiah Messiah. So I'll go, we object to this, we'll say it's racist, that means that he should never have said it. And it's a tactic which many, many people use. Zionists are famous for using it, so any criticism of the State of Israel is automatically anti-Semitic, although I was repeated in stating this in a Guardian article by the Reader's editor the other day, and I was attacked for making that statement. Because that statement was itself anti-Semitic, apparently. And this was at the time of the Gaza blockade and Noah's Ark. And on the web, on the comment pages, the comments underneath the cartoon on the web pages, going on and on and on about this cartoon. And somebody was saying it was clearly anti-Semitic because it had portrayed Noah, which is a Jewish myth. And I got actually quite cross, because I'm not an anti-Semite, I don't like being called one. So I started joining in the fight. I entered below the line, and that just didn't help at all in any way, because they gainsaid everything I said. Because I was, in fact, as an unconsciously anti-Semitic. I didn't realise I was an anti-Semite, but I was, because I'd used this image, and also because I'd specifically used biblical animals. So I then sent him an email saying, well, could you please tell me the biblical chapter and verse where the following animals are mentioned? Polar bears, ostriches, walruses, guanacos, toucans, aardvarks, wallabies, elands, gibbons, and okapis first described to science in 1903. And he then emailed back, this is completely irrelevant. I should then have emailed back, no, the elephant's just at the back. Never mind. And we're going to quickly get over this. This one, Catholics hated that. I think this is sweet. It's after the Pope died. What do you mean, am I pro-life? Hated that. They obviously hated this. Who wouldn't? Look, the Bible says stuff on the little children, so we just made sure they did. And this, of course, is about the Danish cartoons, which I might talk about at great length during the question and answers. But this one, this was the first time, and first and last time, that a cartoon of mine has had to be approved by the editor of The Guardian. We're very lucky, Steve and I, to have such laxity and freedom on The Guardian, but it was such a sensitive topic. And there were many people who did see the face of the prophet in those flames, but of course it isn't there. It's not there at all. But there are some people, I mean, this offence goes everywhere. So here we have Lord Fauntleroy skipping around from like Fotherington Thomas from the Molesworths. but I used the same pose for the cover of New Humanist, and of Richard Dawkins. And I was sort of quite happy to attack Dawkins and Hitchens, particularly over this Out campaign, because I thought it's a campaign Dawkins launched to encourage American atheists to come out of the closet. But he's actually expropriating the language of gay liberation. And gay liberation is about equality before the law for what you are, not for what you think. So I've always been tried the best I can, never ever to attack people because of their ethnicity, their gender or their sexuality, because that is what they are, not what they think. What they think is always open to attack. And atheism, although I'm an atheist, is just an opinion. I might change my mind one day. And so I thought it was fair game. However, according to posters on Dawkins' own website, this was the most disgracefully homophobic image they'd ever seen. Yeah. And it was because I'd apparently portrayed him as an effeminate gay man with limp wrists. Well, you need quite strong wrist muscles to do that. And some people said, no, he's just happy. And they kept on saying, no, it's appallingly homophobic. Dawkins told the editor of New Humanist himself that he actually thought it was homophobic, and somebody said it was clearly homophobic because he was wearing sandals, which are a well-known gay signifier. At which point you think, you can't fucking win. Everything you do is going to be offensive. The really offensive things, like 250,000 of the poorest people on the planet dying in an earthquake, and we're worrying about bonuses for incompetent kleptocrats. That's not offensive. No, it's offensive that, and here they are, these pigs who are dead and they're still eating everything in sight. And, we shove them full of money. That's a cat that never shat, amazingly enough. And here they are as sort of soldier ants having devoured Ireland, having previously devoured Greece on the horizon. None of this is offensive. None of this is offensive. It's offensive being offensive about people's religion. Even if you're going to blow up your underpants, that's offensive. And it's offensive, of course, talking about toilets. There's there's Murdoch watching Fox News, and there he is again. And the most offensive thing, of course, is bad language. So here we have Russell Brand and Jonathan Ross being lynched, while in the foreground we have the fat cat saying, hey, he fucks your economy and I ain't going to apologise or nothing. But occasionally it's the right word. Very occasionally it's the right word. I'm just going to finish off with this one, which I'm very grateful to The Guardian for letting me get away with this, because it made me feel a lot better. And, satire is surgery performed with a cudgel, and it's meant to make things better. And this made me feel so happy, because here we have Tony. This is the beginning of the week when he finally resigned. Hey everyone, look at these great retirement presents. A fork earth, down there, an egg in the shape of a fork, from the EU, a fur cuff, there we are, a cuff made of fur, from Gordon, and fair coffin dye, light tan casket bleach, from the grateful people of Iraq, Afghanistan, and all you guys, i.e. fuck off, fuck off, fuck off and die. And I had somebody emailing me, again, saying, why do you have to be so unrelentingly negative all the time? And I emailed back saying, why do you actually seek out to send your opinions to total strangers about things you don't have to look at? You sort this out, why have you done that? But then again, I think fair coffin dye is quite a good gag. And he emailed back, I've only just got it. It's brilliant. Which just suggests it is worthwhile. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, I had my instructions when I accepted this job. I was taken to the bar and told what you do during Martin's presentation is at key moments you interrupt and ask him a question. I completely failed in that, and I'm delighted to have done so, because to interrupt that would have been a sort of mild sacrilege, really, because it was had all the effervescence and the ebullience of all the wonderful cartoons he's been showing us. But at least now we reach the interactive moment, in which all of you, any of you, one of you, asks a critical question which rocks him back on his heels and prevents him becoming too pleased with himself. Yes, the very back then.
Yes. I spent some time in Australia. And I buy the Australian, which, as you know, is Murdoch paper. I I've forgotten the names of the cartoonists, but one of the features which I'm very conscious of, I'm asking you this because I think it's something which you perhaps might copy, is that if you like a cartoon, you can write to the Australian, who will receive a copy of that cartoon signed by the artist. Now, I collect political cartoons, and I've been delighted with some of them, and I would very much like to think that I can acquire copies of your cartoons, many of which I have not seen before. So can you put that, perhaps to, I take The Guardian every day, to the editor of The Guardian, and if you like, when I go to Australia, I can send you an example of the way in which the Australian prints that opportunity for its readers to receive copies.
That's an excellent proposal. I do, on a freelance basis, if people get in touch with me saying they want a cartoon, I then say, well, you can buy the original, and we haggle, but if that doesn't meet their pocket, and I usually sort of go down quite a lot, I will print a cartoon off, I'll print the cartoon off the computer and send it to them. If they feel like it, they can send me a bottle of whiskey, but they don't have to send me anything if they don't want to. So
I should say that if you do want to buy one of Martin's cartoons, if you go actually, I think the New Humanist website, that after that auction,
the New Humanist website has a whole pile of them
are up there, which are actually available. So I think if you go to the New Humanist website and have a look there, you'll see there's a number there. We had an auction, a very successful auction, but there were some that were left over from that. So
on the subject of the Australian, I can't remember the name of the cartoonist, but it did have one of the funniest cartoons at the time of the whole ridiculous, obscene Danish cartoons Farrago, which was a bunch of jihadis standing around the corpse of a beheaded cartoonist, pointing at him saying, "Call yourself a cartoonist, you can't even draw breath." And it was just captioned, "Now that's funny." And it was. I mean, it was a very, very clever way of looking at it.
Thank you very much. What? Yes, please.
You said it took you a while to get Clegg, and at first you thought you didn't need to draw him, but then you did, and everything else. Is there anyone still now, throughout your career, that you still can't get?
I mean, that's a very good question, and it's surprising, the answer, but I think most cartoonists would agree that actually one of the most difficult people to draw is Ken Clark. And there are several reasons for this. Firstly, Ken Clark is a supremely slippery individual who is so slippery that he actually recognises how slippery he is, and so has this wonderful bluff, oh, let's just go listen to some jazz, I'm a sort of regular kind of guy, facade to cover up his almost inhuman slipperiness underneath. And also, I mean, I sat next to him at a dinner once, and I couldn't get a straight answer out of him about anything. And I think I almost asked him what colour the sky was, and I just couldn't get anything out of him. But also, there's too much to go on. It's a feast of caricaturable things, but there's so much. It's almost like bulimia, caricatural bulimia. You eat too much and you throw up because you don't know where to go. And we're constantly looking over each other's shoulders to see who's done what and how you've actually caught him. But I don't think anybody's quite managed to capture him. Unlike Charles Clarke, who we saw briefly in tampon form. And, if we get a sensible few laws in this country and limit the franchise to cartoonists, he'd be Prime Minister for life. You don't have to do anything. It's just all, just do it straight and he's there. It's wonderful. But I think, but of course the other ones who are really difficult is when somebody new comes on the block and you don't know how to play it, there's nothing to go on until they start bedding themselves down. But of course you only really ever have about sort of 10 or 12 characters, because there are people. I mean, it would be nice to draw Grant Chaps, because he looks like a sort of little rat. And he might be sufficiently noticeable in the coming months when they start ethnically cleansing central London. But at the moment he isn't. So we just have to wait for him to bed down a bit.
Yes, I was amazed that no one
So could you
Just wait 1 second.
This is being recorded for posterity. Lucky old posterity, so they just need to...
I'm amazed that no one's done Ken Clark and selling tobacco cigarettes to Chinese children, as he did with BAT. So cartoonists have a sort of uglification filter that you throw up on people. So I'm always wondering how you see people from day to day. I have a slightly asymmetrical face, so when I look at Steve Bell and his cartoons of Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair with the one bulging eye to denote their sort of, you know, that schizoid thing, it always freaks me out slightly. There must be times when you have to switch that uglification filter off.
Oh, yeah,
how
yeah,
difficult is that?
You do have to switch it off. In practical terms, it was about sort of 19 years ago, I went to an Irish cartoon festival in Rathdrum in the Wicklow Hills, sponsored by Guinness. It's all the information you need. Irish Cartoon Festival, sponsored by Guinness. Anyway, I was sitting in the town square drawing the kiddies, as you were meant to do, and, you know, people buying me endless pints of Guinness. And at one point, some people came up with their Down syndrome daughter. And Holbein's portrait of Anne of Cleves was less flattering than this, because I didn't want to upset these people. I certainly didn't want to upset this child. So I was very flattering. But the point about what I do is it's not to make everybody ugly. It's to attack the elite. That's what the purpose of it is. I have this mantra going on in the back of my head, which is the great American journalist H.L. Mencken's definition of journalism, which does for satire, which is the purpose of journalism is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, which is what our elites get. They understand. They can't do anything about it. It's been a part of the political discourse for 300 years. It's what Americans don't get. They don't get the savagery of our political cartoons. When they started getting the Stephen My stuff in America on the internet, got a lot of emails just sort of confused rather than directly offensive or offended, saying, you know, he's our head of state. He's the chief, you know, the the supreme commander, no, whatever they call it. And, you know, you wouldn't treat the Queen like this. Actually, come and have a look at this. And which leads into another interesting story, you know, about attacking the elite. You're not attacking the elite to make the elite behave differently. You're attacking the elite to make us feel better about the fact they're an elite. And there's a wonderfully instructive story about the French ambassador at the court of St. James in the 1780s, who sent a dispatch to Versailles saying that he was absolutely convinced Britain was on the verge of a revolution, because all the way stretching from Charing Cross down the Strand, down Fleet Street, there were these little kiosks selling satirical prints. You could even borrow them overnight if you wanted to, of the most disgusting depictions of members of the royal family. And this was obviously indicative of the fact that we were about to have a revolution and overthrow the monarchy again. And of course he was completely and absolutely wrong. And what happened, they had it in France, because in France they had these sex libels being passed around in samizdat form all the time, and it was a pressure cooker which then exploded. And here we had the kind of the pressure valve that, laughing at them, stops us beheading them in a way. So maybe that's a shame. Maybe I should stop.
I just one little observation. Sorry, please come in. You were going to ask a question. You won't. No, I was just going to say that it's very interesting to me the way in which comedy, stand-up comedy. We were just talking about this at the bar before. The way in which stand-up comedy has become suddenly the new thing in this country, and that all over the place there are comedians earning vast sums of money and going on tours around hugely crowded, with the most innocuous, sort of vapid, sort of observational comedy about what happened to me on my way out of Tesco's today. It seems to lack all virility and strength and purpose. You know, and to look at was it Channel 4 the other night put on this satirical show? Did you ever see it? I mean, it was like the graveyard. I mean, where is the satire? There was nothing there at all. And it's interesting that in the cartoon industry that hasn't happened. I mean, I think that sort of Bell and yourself, I know that managed to go on being as hard-hitting, as coruscating, as undermining, as anarchic, as irreverent, as blasphemous as you ever were. But comedy, that whole the idea of people like Michael McIntyre becoming the gurus, becoming leading comedians, these absurd people posturing with their tired jokes and semi-gags about a funny thing happened to me on the way to the supermarket. Why is comedy generally so utterly pathetic and lacking in any satirical bite whatsoever? That seems to me to apply to writing as well. There are very few columnists who I can read who seem to have any sort of grasp or satirical edge whatsoever. I mean, in comparison to sort of great satirists who could, as it were, produce something. And yet here, it seems to me, is the one area where we can find incisive, biting, satirical thrust. Or am I generalising too much for your taste? Anyway, there's my little comment. Yes, please. We have someone here who's just down here in the third row. Yes, I'm sorry, but
Hi. Let's imagine that you've got two ideas for the newspaper. One is funny, makes a point, and everyone will get it. The other idea is much funnier, makes a much stronger point, but not everyone will get it. Which one do you go for?
It's a good question. And I'm not entirely sure. You see, I work for, as Laurie said, I work for The Guardian. I also work for The Mirror. And I do different material for each paper because they have different readerships. And you could never depend on everyone getting the... I think I'd probably go for the latter one, if it was considerably funnier. I have in the past, foolishly, occasionally sought editorial advice on these things, so I've missed out two great cartoons. One was when Lord Denning died. You remember Lord Denning, who had sort of said that to allow the appeal of the Birmingham... how many were there in Birmingham? 6. The Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4 would be to call into question the whole basis of British law, and he wished we'd still have the death penalty, so this problem about these people constantly seeking an appeal on their sentences would have been done and dusted. And I just wanted to have him being carried in his coffin, and he's banging from inside his coffin, opening the coffin, and said, "I demand a second opinion." And the pallbearer saying, "To question this would be to call in the doubt the whole basis of British undertaking." And I didn't do it because I asked somebody on the desk, and they said, "Well, no, he has just died. It's a bit disrespectful." And I should have said, "Oh, fuck you," and done it. And filed it late because the one thing they fear more than a bad taste cartoon is an empty space. That's why Steve Bell always files at 8 o'clock. I'll just digress briefly. A wonderful story about how, if you know Steve's work, you may remember this one. It was at the time of Iraq, and it was Bush as the monkey, sort of squatting on the side of a broken toilet, which I think may have had the face of Tony Blair, and wiping his arse with the UN Charter. And there was shit spattered all over the walls behind him. And Georgina Henry, then the deputy editor of the paper, went past the comment desk just as the sub brought it up on his screen. And she looked at this in utter horror. And then she and Steve had this, so to speak, eyeball-to-eyeball negotiation over the phone, until he finally Tipexed out 5 of the turds, which, when I told him was the greatest betrayal of free expression since Galileo. But the other joke I should never have discussed with them was when the House of Lords was going to debate repeal of Clause 28, about teaching about gay sexuality in schools, and I finally drew it for a collection of cartoons put together by Alan Mumford about the House of Lords, but especially for that volume because I was told I couldn't do it, and it would be 2 ermined lords standing in the House of Lords gents having a piss, standing next to each other, and one of them saying to the other, "Hey, fancy a quick no job?" And I was told that this was completely unacceptable in a family newspaper. If I had done it, then there might have been a slight row, it would have gone, but so yeah, go for the funnier one. Go for the funny one. Also, always go for the obvious joke. There have been several occasions when, particularly Dave Brown on The Independent, who is incredibly savage. I mean, he does some fantastically vicious stuff. He and I have done exactly the same joke. When things happen, like, you remember that TV series Walking with Dinosaurs? They had the first episode on as the first night of, or the first day of the 1998 Tory party conference. I mean, come on. I mean, you would have to have a brain of stone not to do that particular cartoon.
Okay, yes.
Just to pick up comedy and satire, how much did Hunter S. Thompson and Ralph Steadman inspire you?
Oh, Ralph is a fantastic inspiration. In fact, I remember buying Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas in about 1976 or 77, when it had just come out here. I had no idea who Hunter S. Thompson was, but on the basis of Ralph's cover, because I was a huge fan. And now I'm very proud of the fact that I'm sort of almost a friend. Ralph is, I think, without question, the greatest graphic artist this country has produced since Gilray, in a way. Interestingly, talking of taking the long view, there's a wonderful kind of, what I was saying earlier about this satire going through the Enlightenment, there is a kind of satirical apostolic succession, because Swift wrote a poem to Hogarth saying that they should collaborate. We would show all the world's follies in a face and things like that. And they never managed to do it. They never managed to sort of match up together, but he wanted to do it. And they could have been the Hunter S. Thompson and the Ralph Steadman of the 18th century, and it would have been truly terrifying. And then, of course, Hogarth did the frontispiece illustrations for the first volume of Tristram Shandy, so there was that kind of succession from Swift through Hogarth to Sterne.
Interestingly, just to pop in, that Stedman, of course, has stopped drawing politicians now because he is...
Ralph said he doesn't do it because it feeds their vanity, and he's probably right. I mean, the subject of politicians' vanity. I did a cartoon... It's weird having the kind of brain I have that you remember these stories which everybody else has completely forgotten. This is in 1996, when two news stories coincided. One was BSE, which was, if you remember, mad cow's disease, which was a fantastic news. So it was when you realised that John Major's government was the first truly postmodern government. It was a truly ironic government because they'd taken our national dish and they had, through a policy of neglect and free market fanaticism, closed down all the local abattoirs and encouraged people to feed the brains of cows to other cows. And so they'd rendered our national dish not only likely to kill you, but first to drive you mad, those two great things of the 18th century, at the end of the Rake's Progresses in Bedlam, and then entered into a trade war with our closest trading partners in order to force them to eat it, so they too would go mad and then die. And Swift could not have made that up with our national dish, Anyway, there was this great story about how the BSE, the sort of prions, had passed the species barrier into the national flock, into the sheep of our great nation. And the same day, there was a little story about how Dennis McShane, subsequently the Europe Minister, had gone to a meeting of Labour Eurosceptic MPs in a committee room in the House of Commons and had started heckling from the back. And this actually was quite a big story because it was when Blair was trying to control the Labour Party and nobody was allowed to do anything at all. And anyway, I did this cartoon of this sheep on its back legs, foaming at the mouth, waving its hooves around. And in the background, there are two other sheep, one saying, "Oh my God, BSE has passed into the national flock." No, that's just Dennis McShane. And it's not a great cartoon, but he rang me up at 7:30 the following morning. I said, I must have the original. No, give me the original. I said, yeah, you can have the original. I said, and you must put me in lots more cartoons. You must put me in as many cartoons as you possibly can. And I said, Dennis, I'm a cartoonist. I'm going to tell absolutely everybody I know about this conversation. I don't care. Put me in more cartoons. Poor old Dennis.
I have a 30-second story about vanity and Stedman, which Martin might just allow me to tell, because years ago I was starting to write a column. My wife of the time was working on the new Statesman, where Stedman was working, and she said, "Oh, don't worry, I'll get Stedman to do a little cartoon of you." So she provided him with some photographs, and duly the cartoon appeared, and my wife Anna showed it to me, and she said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, it seems to me to be absolutely fine." She said, "No, it's not at all. It doesn't look the least bit like you." So I said, "Well, I can't do anything about that. It's Stedman." And she said, "No, you must take it around to Ralph and tell him it doesn't look like you, and could he make some improvements to it?" So I said, I can't go round to a cartoon. It's like going round to Rembrandt and complaining, you know, that, I mean, it doesn't look like me. You can't do it. To go round, I went to his house in Fulham, knocked on the door. I said, I'm so sorry, we've never met. I'm Laureate. He said, yes, I recognise it. Yeah, I said, yes, but I'm so sorry, but I've got there. My wife said, could you possibly, you know, it doesn't look like. She says it's not very good on me. So he said, come with me. So we walked up a flight of stairs. He unrolled the cartoon, put it on the easel, and stuck a whole succession of bats around the top of my head, put a bolt through the neck, gave it me back. He said, and now fuck off. You know, so that cartoon has now appeared for 30 years on the back page of this Times Higher. Every time I look at it, and he once met me later on, he said, were you pleased with that? I said, I don't know what to say. He said, it was to encourage you to be a little bit more outrageous. Every time you look at that, you'll be encouraged to be a little bit more outrageous in your column than you might have been. It's a nice little story about my vanity and Stedman's art. Yes.
Is there anything that would be a taboo for you to draw about, or where you would draw the line in saying, I'm not going to satirize that? And while you're talking about that, maybe you can include what you were going to say about the Muhammad cartoons.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said, I don't attack people because of what they are, because of their ethnicity, their gender, or their sexuality. I attack them because of what they think. And on the subject of the Danish cartoons, I think my response to them was probably slightly counterintuitive and not possibly what you expect, because I thought the publication of them was wrong, or the commissioning of them was wrong, because Jyllands-Posten is a right-wing magazine which has been running a campaign against immigrants for the last sort of 30 years. And they took this story about a children's illustrator not being able to draw the Prophet Muhammad and, you know, whipped it into a media story, which then actually died the death. It was sort of 4 months later when the shit hit the fan, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. But, you know, this was something as part of their anti-immigrant campaign to make the lives of a group of poor and powerless people even more uncomfortable than they were already. People who, for God's sake, empty the bins and clean the toilets in Jyllands-Posten's offices. And one of the best of those Danish cartoons was a cartoon of a small Arabic child writing in Arabic on a blackboard. The editor of Jyllands-Posten is a reactionary, provocative fool. And, of course, he couldn't read Arabic, so he didn't know what it was said, so he ran it anyway. However, as I said, the shit hit the fan 4 or 5 months later when a group of extremely politically ambitious and powerful Danish imams hawked these images around the tyrannies of the Middle East, in Syria and Saudi Arabia, where there were spontaneous demonstrations against this great insult to Islam, and countries where you don't have spontaneous demonstrations. And they included 3 extra images, one of which was of a Muslim at prayer being sodomised by a dog, which certainly never appeared in Jyllands-Posten, and one wonders what its provenance is. It was probably commissioned by them. Because it was pure politics. It ceased to be about cartoons, and it was entirely about people scrabbling for power before the ink had dried on the paper coming off the presses. And the whole thing made me incredibly angry, because although we were all secretly pleased that the word cartoon appeared on headlines of newspapers around the world for about 3 weeks, because what everybody fucking forgot was that almost 100 people, real human beings, died. None of them were Europeans, none of them were cartoonists, all of them were Muslims, all of them were shot dead on the streets of Muslim countries by Muslim policemen or Muslim soldiers because they had been fomented into rioting by Muslim priests who were merely seeking to increase their own political power. And so they were being used as pawns. And those are real dead people. They aren't sort of the kind of stuff I do, which is a mixture of different chemicals in the form of paint on a piece of paper, or this, which is just light reflected on a wall. These are real dead people, and which is one of the reasons why I'm a satirist, because I'm so disgusted permanently by what human beings are prepared to do to other human beings in order to increase their own power. So my guiding... Sorry, I got rather cross then. My guiding instinct is, you know, to attack the fuckers in charge, and there are an awful lot of fuckers in charge, actually, far too many.
Over here? Oh, sorry.
Hi. I've heard your work and the work of plenty of other political cartoonists described as visual journalism. I was just wondering what your personal definition of that is, and also how is visual journalism different to all the other forms of journalism that are out there?
Well, actually, I don't think I necessarily coined that phrase, but I certainly started putting it around. Nobody was using it until I said it was visual journalism. Actually, basically to stop people in the Cartoon Arts Trust pretending they were artists. No, it's journalism because it's reproduced in newspapers, and it gets the originals cost considerably less as a consequence. It is journalism. It is a visual column. A photographer is deemed to be a journalist because it's reproduced in journalism, and I prefer it, actually. There are two kinds of political cartoonists. There are those political cartoonists who think they are artists and are frustrated and embittered because they do not command the value and the prices that artists do because their stuff is reproduced billions of times. And there are people like me who recognise that we're journalists and think, well, we earn a pretty reasonable wedge, and its purpose is polemical. It's a visual column. It's, in the topography of a newspaper, it behaves like a sort of gargoyle squatting on top of the column written by Polly Toynbee underneath, and it's consumed in 8 seconds rather than nibbling away through Polly's copy for 15 minutes. But it's still journalism, and I get very angry with certain cartoonists who, Gerald Scarfe, who claim to be something different from what they are. I mean, I know somebody who told Scarfe he greatly admired his cartoons, and he said they're not cartoons, and walked away. I don't know what they are. But, be proud of it. It's a 300-year-long tradition. I'm very proud of being a visual journalist.
In the middle?
Is there an unwritten code of conduct that once you've kind of come up with an idea of how to do a character, that you own it? So if Steve Bell tomorrow did Clegg as Pinocchio, would you go around and beat him up?
I wouldn't beat him up. Steve and I have had full and frank exchanges of opinions on many things over the years. It doesn't usually involve physical violence, but very, very, very severe verbal violence. No, absolutely, and it's interesting that in Britain this is particularly the case. In American editorial cartoons, as they call them, are marked by the fact they all sort of more or less look the same because they don't have a national press. They will have USA Today and the Washington Post and the New York Times, but they don't really have a national press in the same way we do. They have newspapers, or did until recently, one newspaper per state capital, and they'd have an editorial cartoonist, and so for people to understand what that space in the topography of the paper was, you'd have to draw like Oliphant or McNally. So they say, oh yes, that's a political cartoon. Here we all have to draw differently, otherwise we're accused of plagiarism. And it's incredibly annoying when Steve got Bush as a monkey, because it was obvious he just got there first, and we could do nothing. And it was. I remember Chris Riddell once did Major with his underpants on the outside, thinking it was a sort of general, and it was made very clear to me very quickly, no, you don't do that. That's very, very bad form. You're not allowed to do that. And the reason why Steve was doing Cameron as a squid and now he's got this condom thing was because I got him as Little Lord Fauntleroy. I sort of staked him first. And it keeps us on our toes. Because we are honourable in our dishonour.
Do you, if there was a government in power who you actually liked and really admired, do you think you would struggle to do the job?
Well, but the likelihood of that happening is so remote.
You should know that from everything you said tonight.
The thing is, if we actually got to the kind of society I want, which is a sort of William Morris anarchism, there wouldn't be a press. There would be no need for what I'm doing. I would happily go off and milk the cows and sort of paint murals in the communal eating house and things like that, and it would all be lovely. But the likelihood of that ever happening in my lifetime is so remote. But I'd love it if it did. It's that weird thing I was saying to somebody earlier on. We have cartoonists do suffer habitually from a kind of professional Stockholm syndrome. where we fall in love with our captors. So in 2004, every atom of my being was yearning on behalf of the planet, on behalf of America, on behalf of the rest of the world, for Bush to lose, except this rather persistent, throbbing satire gland back here, saying, oh, God, I just love drawing you so much. And it's a terrible business.
We have time for at least one more, but looking around, is there any other? Yes, here we are.
You've made it quite clear that anger is your muse. Do you ever wake up sometimes in the morning and think, God, I just don't give a damn?
Sorry, what was the last bit?
Do you ever wake up sometimes and think, I don't give a damn? Do you always get fired up by whatever stories are going around?
I have to get fired up because I have to file. Sometimes I file stuff which doesn't fire me up that much. But sometimes it can be a bit weird. A few months ago I finished doing another graphic novel, which is an updated version of Gulliver's Travels. So it's Gulliver's direct descendant going to the same places 300 years later. And what the Houyhnhnms do to the Yahoos is nobody's business. And at the end of it, I just felt so depressed because of the material I was dealing with. It was sort of shit and misanthropy had been occupying my spare time for the previous 14 months. And I was just thinking, I actually would rather like to go and paint some kittens on velvet just to make things a bit better. Have we got very, very briefly time? I missed out my last slide because I was aware that the time was running out. But I just wanted to just... This is just the final one, so we can all go ahead with a spring in our step, realising the redemptive power of the word fuck. Because this was the cartoon I did for the Times. I used to have this gig running for the Times where they'd send me off to do a Hogarthian tableau every week of some event I'd covered. And this was the launch of the book of the caricatures and the Gay Hussar, which I did as the final cartoon I did for the Times. Because 6 weeks prior to this, the new Saturday editor of the Times, a man called George Brock, you remember that name, had his PA had rung me up or emailed me saying that George wants to have lunch with you. And I knew George Brock. I'd known him for quite a long time. I quite liked him. But he wants to have lunch with you. And being a freelance journalist, I know that the thing I must always do is avoid ever seeing the editor, because the only time I'll ever see the editor is when he's going to sack me. So I was a bit worried about this, but I went to meet him for lunch. And the first thing he said was, Martin, rest assured, this meeting has no bearing whatsoever on your relationship with Times newspapers, which will go from strength to strength. At which point I thought, shit, I've got 8 weeks. And then he said, I think in the new compact rather than tabloid Times, I think that cartoons work so much better vertically than horizontally, don't you? At which point I thought, shit, this man's an idiot. I've got 6 weeks. And actually, 6 weeks later, I got a letter saying they were having problems with the new second section on Saturdays, and they were having to move Julie Burchell's column into the main paper, and therefore, with enormous regret, they were going to have to let me go. Which, believe me, is without question the most humiliating thing that has ever happened to me. And they foolishly gave me 2 weeks' notice, and this was the last cartoon I did. And if we just look at this, is it possible to dim the lights a bit, just so we can get this in its full glory? You will see. We have posed here. These are all people who are actually illustrated in the book. We have my friend and colleague Steve Bell up there, and next to him, in front of him, is Kevin Maguire, political editor of The Mirror. And their arms are sort of spread out in an F as they raise their glasses. And here we have Mark Seddon, that's my wife Anna there. We have Mark Seddon, the former editor of Tribune, and behind him Kenneth Baker, the former education secretary, whose arms are in a U. And here we have Simon Hoggart, who was not there but is there in spirit, Mike White behind him, as a C. And here is me with Michael Foot's arm forming a K. Here we have former editor of The People, Bill Haggerty, and Geoffrey Goodman, former industrial editor of The Mirror, as a B, with libel editor of the book, as an R, Brendan Barber, general secretary of the TUC, and Lord Lamont as an O, Ilted Harrington and David Seymour as a C, and Sean McGee and the manager of the London Review bookshop as a K, spelling out, in a disguised way, the phrase fuck Brock, which they then ran on half a page of the Times. And I then rang up Francis Wheen on Private Eye and told him, and he told the world. And apparently, because Brock wasn't very popular, they dancing on the newsroom floor of the Times that when that issue of Private Eye came out. And I will never, ever, ever work for the Times again, without question. Never, ever, ever. I've broken all the cardinal rules. And it was incredibly childish and puerile and immature. And it made me feel so much better. Because essentially I had won. Because that's what this stuff does. That's what, you know, the stupid jokes about the mocking the king, the thumbing your nose at authority does, because it is a struggle between us and them. It is unequal. There's no reason why these people should have power over us and exert their autonomy over us. And the one way of us making ourselves feel better about it is laughing at the cunts. That's it.
I don't really need to add a word, except just formally, I suppose, because this is a podcast, video, 3D surround sound production, so I suppose we should have a sort of like an ending just to say I think we should all be so grateful that Martin is with us with all that vigour, with all that humanity, with all that acerbity, and with a little bit of puerility as well. Martin Rowson, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.